My name is Sophia. I am in my mid-30s, and for most of my adult life, I've been described with words like steady, low maintenance, and easy to be around. I work in a role that requires precision and restraint. I listen more than I speak. I notice patterns. People often mistake that for softness, or worse, for absence. This story isn't about drama. It isn't about revenge. And it's not a warning disguised as entertainment. It's a record. A personal account of how truth has weight, how silence can be a decision, and how dignity doesn't need volume to be heard. My spouse revealed a secret child at our wedding reception. But they are not the whole story. They are not even the most important parts. What follows is not a recounting of a single shocking event. It's the slow accumulation of small moments, glances that lingered too long, conversations that ended too quickly, assumptions made because I didn't interrupt. It's about how a role gets assigned to you quietly, without your consent, and how long it can take to realize you've been playing it. People often say I'm hard to read, that I'm composed. What they don't usually see is how much I absorb before I act. I don't believe in public breakdowns or performative strength. I believe in accuracy, in timing, in letting people reveal themselves fully before I decide what the truth requires of me. This story moves through disbelief, then clarity, through grief that doesn't scream, and anger that doesn't need witnesses. It's about learning that being underestimated can become leverage, not because you plan to use it, but because others never imagine you might. I won't dramatize what doesn't need drama. I won't exaggerate anyone into a villain. I'll tell you what happened, what I felt, and what I chose, without embellishment and without asking you to take sides. If you're listening because you've ever felt invisible in a room where decisions were being made about your life, if you've ever stayed quiet not because you were weak, but because you were watching, then maybe the story will feel familiar. Before we go any further, I want to ask you, gently and without expectation, have you ever sensed something was wrong long before you had proof, and wondered whether your silence was patience or preparation? To them, I was dependable. That was the word people used most often when they described me. My husband, his family, our friends. Dependable meant I arrived early and stayed late. It meant I remembered birthdays without reminders, smoothed over awkward moments before they became problems, and filled in gaps no one else noticed. Dependable meant I didn't demand much space. At gatherings, I was usually placed next to someone elderly or shy, as if my calmness were a cushion. Sophia will keep you company, they'd say, already turning away. I learned early that my presence was considered useful, not essential. Something stable in the background, like good lighting or a reliable chair. My husband used to say he admired how easy I was. You don't make things complicated, he'd tell people, smiling as if he were complimenting me. I would smile too because at the time, I thought he meant emotionally mature. What he really meant, I would understand much later, was that I didn't interrupt the flow of his life. In our relationship, I was the listener, the planner, the one who handled logistics quietly so we could enjoy the results publicly. When decisions were made, they often appeared as conclusions rather than discussions. I told myself this was a partnership, division of labor, trust. I didn't yet have the language to call it something else. His family treated me kindly, in a distant way, polite, grateful. I was thanked for hosting, for organizing, and for remembering details they forgot, but rarely asked what I thought. When opinions were exchanged, they happened around me, not with me. I didn't protest because I didn't feel erased. Not consciously, I felt assumed, as if my agreement was built into the room. Friends describe me as the grounded one, the one who didn't gossip, didn't overreact, didn't take things personally. I wore that reputation carefully. It became armor. If you are calm enough, long enough, people stop imagining that you could be hurt. Even I began to believe that. Looking back, I can see how invisibility forms without cruelty. No one pushed me into a corner. I simply stepped back whenever the space felt crowded, trusting someone would notice eventually. They didn't. They just filled the space I left. At work, I was promoted steadily but quietly. I didn't campaign for recognition. I documented everything, delivered results, and moved on. That habit, documentation, was something I'd learned early, not out of suspicion, but out of respect for accuracy. I liked knowing what was real. At home, that habit softened. I trusted. I believed that if something mattered, it would be shared. That intimacy meant transparency by default. I see now how naive that was, not foolish, but unguarded. In our social circle, my husband was considered charismatic, generous, slightly mysterious in a way people found appealing. I was often introduced as his balance. "She keeps him grounded," someone once said at a dinner party, patting my hand as if I were a good influence, rather than a full person. I didn't correct them, because at that stage, I didn't yet feel wronged. I felt chosen. I believed that being steady was a kind of power, that being trusted with calm was a privilege. I thought restraint equaled respect. What I didn't realize was that restraint, when unacknowledged, can slowly become permission. Permission to omit. Permission to delay truth. Permission to assume silence means acceptance. If you asked anyone who I was in that story, they would have said, the reliable wife, the composed woman, the one who would understand. No one would have said, the one who was paying attention. And perhaps that was the greatest misunderstanding of all. The first time it happened, it was small enough to excuse. We were engaged, already deep into the routines of planning a life together. Venues, guest lists, schedules that required deposits and signatures. The kind of logistics that make everything feel official before anything has actually happened. I remember thinking that this stage was supposed to bring clarity. Instead, it introduced a quiet blur. It was an evening with friends, nothing formal. Someone asked a harmless question about timing, how long we'd been together when we'd met. My husband answered quickly and confidently. His version wasn't wrong exactly, just edited. He skipped a year, not an important year, you might think. And that's what I told myself. A rounding error, a conversational shortcut. Everyone does it. But I noticed how smoothly it happened, how easily the omission fit into the sentence, like a well-practiced pause. I didn't correct him. The room moved on. Later that night, when it was just the two of us, I asked gently, not accusing, curious. "You skipped that first year," I said. "The one when we were long distance." He laughed, light and immediate. Did I? I didn't even realize. That was the first cut. Not the omission, but the dismissal of its existence. The suggestion that my memory was more attentive than necessary. "It didn't seem relevant," he added, already distracted by his phone. "People don't need every detail." I let it go. I told myself he was right. Not every detail matters. And yet something had mattered enough for him to remove it. After that, there were more moments like it. Always subtle, a name mentioned without context, a story told with a missing chapter. When I filled in the gap, it was brushed off with a smile. "You're overthinking," he'd say, or, "It's not that deep." And because I didn't want to be the kind of person who made everything deep, I agreed. I trained myself to shrink my questions into observations, then into silence. At one point, I noticed he'd started stepping out to take phone calls, not hiding them, just relocating. If I asked who it was, he'd answer easily. Coworker, old friend, nothing secretive, but nothing inviting either. Again, no single moment demanded confrontation. There was no smoking gun, no sudden shift in behavior dramatic enough to justify alarm. Just a series of choices that gently moved information away from shared space. What stayed with me was how others reacted. When plans changed without my input, people assumed I knew. When details emerged late, they assumed I'd agreed. My quiet presence had become a stand-in for consent. Once his sister joked, "Sophia doesn't mind, she's flexible." Everyone laughed, including me. I can still hear that laugh now. How easily it came. How much effort it took not to let it falter. The first real discomfort arrived not as anger, but as confusion. I couldn't tell whether I was being excluded or simply not included, whether the difference even mattered. I began keeping notes, not because I suspected betrayal, but because I wanted to ground myself. Dates, conversations, small inconsistencies. Not to build a case, but to check my own perception, to reassure myself that I wasn't imagining patterns where none existed. What surprised me was how quickly those notes accumulated. Nothing damning, nothing dramatic, just a growing list of moments where my understanding lagged behind decisions already made. Still, I didn't speak up, because speaking up would require asserting that something was wrong, and I didn't yet feel wronged, just slightly misaligned, like furniture pushed an inch off center. Everyone else seemed comfortable, so I told myself comfort was the goal. I didn't know then that this was how the ground softens before it gives way. Not with cracks or noise, but with quiet adjustments that teach you to doubt your footing. That was the first small cut, and like most small cuts, it wasn't painful enough to stop what I was doing. Once you accept the first explanation, the rest arrive more easily. I didn't notice when my tolerance shifted, only that it did. What once would have prompted a question now barely registered. not because the behavior stopped, but because I had learned how to reinterpret it in ways that kept the peace. If information arrived late, I told myself he was busy. If plans changed without discussion, I assumed flexibility was a virtue. If my discomfort surfaced, I labeled it sensitivity and pressed it back down. This is how normalization works, not through agreement, but through repetition. There were small rituals that formed around this new reality. I learned which topics to approach lightly, which questions to delay until the timing felt right, which often meant never. I became skilled at sensing when a conversation would close if I pushed, and retreating before it did. What disturbed me wasn't that I felt unheard. It was that everyone else seemed comfortable with that arrangement. At dinners, decisions were announced as updates. "We're doing it this way," he'd say, and heads would nod. Sometimes he'd glance at me afterward, a quick check-in, as if that look alone constituted inclusion. I nodded back. The moment passed. No one noticed what hadn't happened. Once I suggested an alternative, something minor, a scheduling issue. The response was immediate and gentle, which somehow made it worse. "That's complicated," someone said. "This way is easier." Easier for whom, I wondered, but I didn't ask. I began to sense that my role was not to contribute ideas, but to absorb friction, to be the soft surface decisions landed on so they didn't have to bounce back. I told myself this was maturity. Those relationships required compromise. That being low conflict was a strength. What I didn't acknowledge was that compromise requires both sides to adjust. This was accommodation, one-directional, and quiet. The moments that stayed with me were not the obvious ones, but the casual remarks that revealed assumptions. "You're so understanding," people said when I accepted explanations without challenge. "She doesn't need details," someone joked once. "She trusts you." Trust. That word was used often, like a shield, as if asking questions would be a betrayal of it. And so I learned to trust without verification, or at least to appear to. Inside, something was changing. I started to feel like a guest in my own life, informed but not consulted, present but not central. My emotions became things I processed privately, then set aside so they wouldn't disrupt the rhythm everyone else enjoyed. Even my body adjusted. I slept lightly. I listened more carefully to the tone than to the words. I began noticing what wasn't said as much as what was. Still, I stayed quiet. Part of that was fear, not of confrontation, but of disruption. I worried that if I named the imbalance, I'd be told it wasn't there, that I'd be accused of imagining slights, of projecting insecurity. I had seen that happen to other women. I didn't want to join them. Another part was hope. Hope that this was temporary, that once the wedding was over, once life settled, transparency would follow. That hope kept me compliant longer than I cared to admit. I remember one evening clearly. We were reviewing final details for the reception, guest list changes, last-minute adjustments. He mentioned adding someone I didn't recognize. "Who's that?" I asked casually. "Oh, just someone from my past," he said. "It's nothing. Don't worry about it." Don't worry about it. That phrase became a refrain, not harsh, not dismissive, just final. A gentle closing of a door I hadn't realized was open. I nodded, made a note, told myself there would be time later. What I didn't realize then was that later was being quietly engineered out of reach. Disrespect doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in reassurance, softened by tone, disguised as efficiency. And when you accept it once, it learns how to stay. By the time I noticed how often my needs were postponed in favor of convenience, I had already become skilled at explaining it away, to others and to myself. It wasn't a conversation. No one sat me down and explained what was expected of me. The role appeared gradually, shaped by repetition, and rewarded with approval whenever I stayed within its edges. I was the stabilizer, the one who made things work without needing credit, the one who smoothed over tension with a smile, who adapted quickly, who didn't ask for reassurance because she was the reassurance. People leaned on me without noticing the weight they placed there. In group settings, I was introduced by function. "This is Sophia. She organized everything. She's the reason this all came together." Compliments, yes, but always attached to output, never presence. I was valued for what I facilitated, not for what I felt. When stress surfaced, wedding stress, family stress, it was assumed I could handle more. If someone else faltered, I compensated. If plans shifted, I adjusted. Reliability became my defining trait, and like all defining traits, it began to eclipse everything else. My husband leaned into this version of me easily. "You're so good at keeping things calm," he'd say, often after I absorbed a situation that should have been shared. He meant it as praise. I received it like an obligation. I noticed that when I expressed uncertainty, it was met with surprise, as if doubt didn't belong to me. "You, worried?" he once asked, half smiling. "You're the strong one." Strong. Another word that sounded generous until I understood its cost. Strong meant I wouldn't need explanations. Strong meant I wouldn't push back. Strong meant I could carry discomfort quietly so others didn't have to. I began to see how this role benefited everyone else. It created efficiency. Decisions moved faster. Emotions stayed manageable. No one had to slow down to accommodate my processing. And because I was good at it, the role hardened. If I hesitated, it was interpreted as momentary, not meaningful. If I went quiet, it was read as agreement. My silence had been translated so many times that it no longer belonged to me. I remember standing in the reception hall during a walkthrough, watching vendors adjust lighting and tables. Everyone was busy. Conversations overlapped. My husband was giving instructions, confident and composed. Someone asked a question about timing. He answered without looking at me. It struck me then, not sharply but clearly, that I had become part of the infrastructure, important but replaceable, necessary but not consulted. That realization didn't hurt immediately. It settled, like a weight placed carefully, deliberately, so it wouldn't be noticed. I asked myself if I had allowed this. The uncomfortable answer was yes, partially. Not because I lacked boundaries, but because I believed harmony was worth the trade. What I hadn't anticipated was how easily harmony could become erasure. There were moments I considered pushing back, reclaiming space, asking for clarity, but each time the cost felt too high. I imagined being labeled difficult, emotional, and disruptive. I had worked too hard to be seen as composed to risk that shift, and so I stayed within the role, reliable, useful, invisible when it mattered. The irony was that I was more aware than anyone realized. I heard the assumptions forming around me. I saw the way decisions bypassed me, then returned as phase accompli. I noticed how often my agreement was presumed rather than requested. But awareness without action can feel like complicity. That tension began to live inside me, not as anger, but as something colder, a quiet reckoning. I started to understand that the role I'd been assigned was not accidental, and it was not temporary. It was convenient. And convenience, once established, resists change. I didn't yet know what I would do with that understanding. I only knew that something in me had shifted, from acceptance to observation, from participation to watchfulness. The role was clear now. What remained unclear was whether I would continue to play it. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no raised voice, no accusation, no moment dramatic enough to mark on a calendar. It happened on a day that looked ordinary from the outside, which is perhaps why it took me so long to recognize it for what it was. It was a quiet afternoon, weeks before the wedding. I had taken time off work to finalize details, confirmations, payments, schedules that required calm attention. The apartment was still. My husband had stepped out for what he said would be a quick errand. His laptop was open on the dining table. I wasn't looking for anything. I wasn't suspicious. I had simply needed to check an email confirmation that had been sent to his address. We shared devices freely, or so I believed. When the screen lit up, a notification appeared before I could look away. A name I didn't recognize, a message preview that wasn't explicit, just familiar. "Did you tell her yet?" There was no panic in me, no rush of adrenaline, just a sudden clarity, like a lens snapping into focus. I didn't open the message. I didn't scroll. I didn't need to. The question itself was enough to rearrange something fundamental in my mind. "Tell me what?" I closed the laptop and sat back, hands folded, breathing steady. I remember noticing how quiet my body was. No trembling, no racing thoughts. Just an awareness that something I had been circling without naming had finally taken shape. This was not about infidelity, not yet. It was about omission, about parallel narratives, about a truth that existed somewhere adjacent to my life, close enough to touch, but never offered to me. When he returned, I didn't confront him. I watched him instead. I watched how he spoke, what he volunteered, what he withheld. I noticed how his sentences were constructed, where they ended abruptly, where they curved away from detail. It was as if I had learned a new language overnight. That evening, he mentioned meeting someone the next day, casually, no names. "Do I know them?" I asked. He hesitated, just long enough. "Not really," he said. "It's from before we met." Before we met. There it was again, the past as a sealed container, referenced but never opened. I nodded, as I always did, but inside something had settled into place. I realized then that I had been waiting for permission to ask the right questions. waiting for a signal that it was appropriate to demand full inclusion in my own life. That day, I understood I would never be given that permission. The shift was not anger, it was detachment. Not emotional withdrawal, but intellectual clarity. I stopped explaining his behavior to myself, stopped filling in blanks with optimism. Instead, I began observing with intention. I thought back to the notes I had taken over months, dates, conversations, inconsistencies I dismissed as noise. They are aligned now, not into a story yet, but into a shape. I didn't feel betrayed. That came later. What I felt was awake. For the first time, I considered the possibility that silence could be something other than endurance. That it could be a position, a choice. That night, lying beside him, I listened to his breathing and realized how much of our life was built on what I did not know, and how carefully that not knowing had been maintained. I didn't cry. I didn't demand answers. I didn't change my behavior in any visible way. What changed was internal. I stopped assuming good faith where there was no evidence. I stopped offering emotional labor preemptively. I began to separate what was shared from what was concealed. The next morning, I opened my notebook and wrote a single line. Observe. Do not interrupt. That was the day something shifted, not in the world around me, but in the way I occupied it. From that point on, silence was no longer something that happened to me. It was something I chose. Once silence became intentional, everything sounded different. I spoke when necessary. I smiled when expected. On the surface, nothing changed. But internally, I had stepped out of the role I'd been playing and into a vantage point I hadn't known I was allowed to occupy. I stopped filling in gaps. When my husband spoke vaguely, I no longer helped him clarify. When plans were announced without context, I didn't rush to understand. I let the absence remain visible, even if no one else seemed to notice it. It was astonishing how quickly people misread this shift. They thought I was relaxed. They thought I was trusting him completely. They thought my quiet meant contentment. In truth, my silence had become a filter. It separated what was offered freely from what was guarded, and the difference was instructive. I began to notice patterns in timing. Certain topics always appeared late in the evening, when questions felt inconvenient. Others were mentioned only in passing, designed to be acknowledged but not examined. Names without stories, events without context. I wrote everything down, not obsessively, not emotionally, just precisely. Dates, exact wording, who was present, what was said, and what wasn't. This wasn't preparation for confrontation. It was calibration. I needed to know whether what I was sensing was real, or whether I had simply grown suspicious. The notes confirmed it. Silence gave me access to things noise would have disrupted. People speak differently when they think you aren't listening closely. They reveal more when they believe you're uninterested. And because I had been labeled easy, no one adjusted their behavior around me. My husband in particular seemed relieved. "You've been so calm lately," he said one evening. "I was worried wedding stress would get to you." I smiled. "I'm fine." It was the truth, but not the version he assumed. I wasn't calm because I was unbothered. I was calm because I had stopped negotiating reality. I accepted that there was a version of his life that did not include me fully. That acceptance freed me from the need to chase inclusion. Instead, I watched. I noticed how often his phone was left in the room with him, how notifications were silenced in my presence but reappeared when he thought I was occupied. None of it was dramatic. All of it was consistent. People imagine secrecy as frantic. In reality, it's methodical. At social gatherings, I observed how others interacted with him, who avoided eye contact, who lingered too long. There was one woman in particular whose presence registered differently, not threatening, not intimate, just waited, like something unresolved. No one acknowledged it, including me. Silence allowed me to test something else, how people behaved when I didn't compensate. If I didn't smooth a moment, did anyone else step in? If I didn't reassure, did concern appear? Often the answer was no, and that absence told me more than any confession could have. I realized then that my earlier fear, that silence would make me disappear, had been misplaced. I had already been invisible in the ways that mattered. Choosing silence simply meant I stopped pretending otherwise. There was power in that. Not power over him, power over myself. I no longer felt the urge to confront inconsistencies immediately. I didn't need reassurance. I needed accuracy, and accuracy required patience. I began preparing, not outwardly, not materially, internally. I rehearsed what it would mean to know the full truth, and what it would require of me if I did. I asked myself difficult questions. What would I do if this life were not what I believed it to be? What would dignity look like then? What would restraint require? These were not hypothetical exercises. They were foundations. By the time the wedding day approached, I was no longer moving forward due to momentum. I was moving forward deliberately, aware that something unresolved was traveling with us toward that moment. Silence by then was not passive. It was strategic. And while everyone else mistook it for weakness, it gave me the one thing I had been missing from the beginning: time. What they never noticed was not the silence. It was what the silence allowed me to build. Outwardly, I was still moving through the same routines, confirming vendors, answering messages, smiling through congratulations. Inside, I had shifted into a mode I recognized from work. Quiet assessment. When something matters, you don't rush it. You observe long enough to understand its structure. I stopped asking questions that would trigger rehearsed answers. Instead, I asked the kind that invited assumptions. Do you think everything is settled now? Is there anything left unresolved from before? He answered easily, confidently, and each answer told me more about what he believed I knew and what he believed I didn't. I noticed that when I used general language, he relaxed. When I used specifics, he deflected. So I stayed general. I let him underestimate the depth of my awareness. At night, after he slept, I reviewed my notes. Not to feed anxiety, there was surprisingly little of that, but to map continuity. The human mind is good at tolerating contradictions in isolation. On paper, they align, or they don't. They aligned. I also began noticing what wasn't in my notes yet. Gaps that suggested intention. Certain time periods were vague. Certain names appeared without explanation. Certain events were referenced repeatedly but never anchored. Patterns don't accuse. They simply exist. I didn't tell anyone, not my closest friend, not my family. This wasn't secrecy. It was containment. I needed clarity before commentary. Once spoken, things changed shape. I wasn't ready for that yet. What surprised me most was how much people revealed when they believed nothing was at stake. His mother mentioned someone from a long time ago in passing, then corrected herself quickly. A friend hesitated before answering a question about timelines, then laughed it off. No one lied outright. They just spoke about something. That kind of coordination doesn't happen accidentally. Still, I didn't jump to conclusions. I gathered context. I learned how to listen without reacting, how to follow threads without pulling them. I also prepared practically, not dramatically, quietly. I reviewed the documents we had signed. I reread agreements, checked dates, and made copies. I ensured I understood what was legally shared and what was not. Knowledge is not confrontation, it's insurance. At work, this would have been standard procedure. At home, it felt like crossing an invisible line. But once crossed, it felt steady. I began to sense that whatever I was not being told had been carefully timed. Not to deceive maliciously, but to avoid disruption, to preserve momentum. Weddings have momentum. Once set in motion, they resist interruption. Too many people are involved. Too many expectations. I wondered whether that was the point. What they never noticed was that I had stopped assuming benevolent intent. I didn't assume malice either. I simply stopped filling in blanks. That neutrality was my leverage. I also practiced restraint. I imagined different outcomes, not emotionally, but structurally. If the truth emerged before the wedding, during it, or after. What would each scenario require of me? I didn't rehearse speeches, I rehearsed silence. I reminded myself that reaction gives power away prematurely, that dignity is most visible when it isn't performing. By the time the rehearsal dinner arrived, I felt oddly grounded. People commented on how composed I seemed. "You're handling this so well," someone said, squeezing my hand. "Most brides would be a wreck." I smiled. I like being prepared. They thought I meant schedules. What they never noticed was how little I needed reassurance anymore. I had stopped seeking confirmation of my role, my value, my place. I knew exactly where I stood, and because I hadn't revealed that knowledge, everyone else continued as they were, assuming the version of me they had always known was still intact. That assumption protected me. It gave me time to decide, not react, when the moment arrived, because by then I understood something crucial. Whatever was coming would not be an interruption of my life. It would be a revelation of what my life already was, and I would meet it awake. The reveal did not arrive with evidence spread across a table or a confession delivered in shame. It arrived quietly, the way truths often do when they have been waiting long enough to be noticed. It was a message sent to the wrong place, not to me directly, to an old email address of his that still forwarded to a shared inbox we rarely used. I only opened it because I was clearing clutter. Final preparations had a way of making everything feel urgent, even digital housekeeping. The subject line was neutral, administrative. Nothing suggested importance. Inside, the language was careful, polite, familiar, It referenced a schedule, a school calendar, a pickup time, and then, unmistakably, a child's name, paired with his last name. I read it once, then again. There was no shock in my body, no racing thoughts, just the unmistakable sensation of something clicking fully into place. A child, not a rumor, not a possibility, a structure, a routine. A life that had been operating parallel to mine, with enough consistency to generate schedules and expectations. I didn't scroll further, I didn't search for more immediately. I closed the email and sat still, letting the information settle without forcing it into meaning. This was not the moment for emotion, this was the moment for clarity. I thought of the phrases I had heard over the past year, from before we met. It's nothing, don't worry about it. I thought of the woman whose presence had felt weighted, the omissions that had clustered around certain timeframes. This explained the coordination, the careful language, the urgency to keep things smooth. A secret like this doesn't exist alone. It creates a system around itself. I didn't confront him, not because I was afraid, and not because I needed more proof. I already had enough. What I needed now was control over timing. I spent the next few hours reading, not messages, but documents. I looked up public records. I verified what could be verified without intrusion. I confirmed what this meant legally, practically, and structurally. Every step was deliberate. I didn't cry. That came later, in a private space, once decisions had been made. In that moment, I felt something steadier, respect for the truth, however inconvenient it was. This was not about betrayal in the abstract. It was about consent, about building a future with someone, while critical facts were withheld, about standing at the threshold of a public commitment without full knowledge of what that commitment entailed. That clarity stripped away any remaining confusion. I understood then why the wedding had to proceed as planned, why nothing disruptive could be allowed beforehand, why I had been positioned as flexible, understanding, and strong. The reveal wasn't just that he was a father, it was that I had been managed. I closed my notebook and opened a new page. I wrote down what I knew, what I could confirm, what remained unknown, but likely. I did not speculate beyond evidence I didn't need to. There was no satisfaction in this discovery, no triumph, only a narrowing of options. Once you know something like this, you cannot unknow it. You cannot pretend it doesn't change the foundation of what you're building. The question was not whether to act. It was how and when. I looked at the calendar. The wedding was days away. Guests were arriving, contracts were signed, lives were in motion. I realized then that the power I held was not in exposure, but in restraint. In choosing the moment when truth would be acknowledged, and by whom. I went to bed that night beside him, aware of the child whose existence had been edited out of my reality, and felt no rage. What I felt was resolve. This was no longer about me fitting into a role. It was about deciding whether I would step into a future that had been designed without my informed consent. And that decision, I knew, would be irreversible. There are moments when the future divides cleanly, when every possible path becomes visible at once, and you understand that choosing one means abandoning the others forever. This was one of those moments. I didn't rush the decision. I sat with it, letting each option reveal its cost. I could confront him immediately, demand explanations, force the truth into the open before witnesses arrived, before vows were spoken. That path promised emotional honesty, but it also promised chaos, public, irreversible, and not entirely mine to control once unleashed. I could postpone everything. Marry him, then address it privately afterward. Maintain appearances, preserve stability. That path required a level of self-erasure I no longer possessed. It would mean consenting retroactively to a life I had not chosen knowingly. I could leave quietly, cancel the wedding without explanation, absorb the fallout alone. That path offered dignity, but it also meant allowing the narrative to be written without me, to be recast as cold, panicked, or cruel. And then there was the fourth option, the one that required the most restraint. I could proceed exactly as planned, without exposing him, without alerting anyone, and position myself so that when the truth surfaced, it would do so without hysteria, without spectacle, and without me having to raise my voice. This option wasn't about punishment, it was about authorship. I understood something crucial then. The timing of truth determines who controls its meaning. And I refused to let the story be framed as my emotional reaction to his secret. I wanted it to be framed as a fact. To choose that path, I had to be certain of myself. Not righteous, not angry, certain. I asked myself one question repeatedly. What action aligns with my values, not my emotions? My values were clear. I believed in truth without cruelty, in consequence without humiliation, in dignity that does not require witnesses. Proceeding with the wedding was not a denial. It was containment, a way to keep the truth intact until it could be acknowledged properly, without theatrics, without manipulation. I also understood that this choice would cost me something. I would have to stand beside him knowing what I knew. I would have to listen to vows layered over omission. I would have to be still when my body wanted to recoil. But I had still before. This time, it would be on my terms. I didn't tell anyone, not because I was protecting him, but because I was protecting the clarity of the moment that would come later. Once others know, they demand action that serves their comfort, not your truth. I finalized one last thing that night, quietly, efficiently, a decision that required no announcement, no approval. I ensured that I retained agency. The morning of the wedding arrived with the softness of inevitability. There was no drama in me, no shaking hands. I felt anchored. As I dressed, I looked at myself in the mirror and saw not a bride in denial, but a woman standing at a threshold with open eyes. I wasn't pretending that nothing was wrong. I was choosing when it would be acknowledged. When the ceremony began, I walked forward with measured steps. I listened. I repeated the words required of me, not because they erased what I knew, but because they did not yet bind me to what I would not accept. Marriage, I understood then, is not only about vows, it is about informed consent. And that consent had not yet been given. The decision was made, not in defiance, not in fear, but in alignment with who I had become. I would not expose him impulsively. I would not sacrifice myself quietly. I would let the truth arrive in its own time, undeniable, unembellished, and irreversible. The days immediately after the wedding were exactly as everyone expected them to be. Congratulatory messages arrived in waves. Photos were tagged. Stories were told and retold, polished into something celebratory and simple. From the outside, we looked like a beginning. Inside, I was already preparing an ending, quietly, methodically, without urgency. This was the phase where silence did its most important work. I didn't withdraw emotionally. That would have been noticed. Instead, I became neutral, present without offering more than necessary, warm without intimacy. It was a careful balance, but one I had practiced for years without realizing it. I started with structure. I reviewed financial arrangements calmly, as if this were an audit rather than a crisis. I confirmed what was shared, what was individual, and what documentation existed. I made copies, not to accuse, but to protect accuracy. I scheduled consultations under practical pretenses. Administrative, preventative. I didn't rush to conclusions or ask leading questions. I listened, I learned. What struck me was how much power lies in preparation that no one sees. At home, nothing appeared different. We unpacked gifts, thank you cards were discussed. Future plans were mentioned casually, travel, work, timing. He spoke in plurals. We will, we should. I let those sentences pass without correcting them. Because correction wasn't the point. Positioning was. I updated my personal records, ensured access to accounts that required it, re-established independent financial pathways that I had let grow dormant out of convenience. None of this was dramatic. It was simply restoring symmetry. At night, I wrote, not emotionally, strategically. I documented conversations as they happened, verbatim when possible. I noted dates, phrasing, and tone, not because I intended to use them publicly, but because memory softens under pressure. Records do not. Meanwhile, consequences began forming invisibly. I declined certain commitments politely, shifted timelines subtly. I stopped anchoring my future plans to his availability. I reclaimed time without announcing it. If he noticed, he didn't say anything. He mistook my calm for contentment, my lack of questions for trust. The narrative he believed about me protected him from imagining I might be doing anything other than adjusting. That assumption was my shield. I also watched how he managed the secret now that the wedding had passed. The calls continued. The careful phrasing remained. The emotional partitioning required to maintain two realities became more visible without effort on my part. I didn't interfere. Interference creates noise. Noise invites defensiveness. Silence allowed reality to speak for itself. I wasn't gathering ammunition. I was gathering confirmation. Not for others, for myself. So that when I acted, there would be no internal debate left to resolve. There was one moment, weeks later, when he mentioned the woman again, indirectly. She's just dealing with something complicated, he said, as if narrating a logistical inconvenience. I nodded. That sounds like it requires honesty. He paused, looked at me briefly, then looked away. That pause told me everything. By then, my path was set, not in anger, in acceptance. I understood that people often believe silence is an invitation to continue. In reality, it can be a countdown. Everything I did during that time was designed to preserve one thing: my ability to exit without chaos, without distortion, and without needing to convince anyone of what was true. Because when the truth finally emerged, it would not be carried by my voice. It would already be standing, and I would simply step aside. Consequences rarely arrive with announcements. They begin as absences, small shifts that register only after they accumulate. At first, no one noticed what I had stopped doing. I no longer reminded him of deadlines. I didn't track his schedule in my head. I didn't anticipate needs before they were voiced. The invisible scaffolding I had built around our shared life remained in place structurally, but it was no longer being reinforced. Things started slipping, nothing catastrophic. Just delays, missed follow-ups, minor misunderstandings that required effort to correct. He mentioned feeling overwhelmed more often, though he couldn't identify why. "You used to be so on top of things," he said once, half joking. "I still am," I replied, and I was, just not for him. Friends noticed next. Plans took longer to coordinate. Messages went unanswered longer than usual. When questions came to me, logistical, emotional, social, I responded politely but without initiative. "I'll let you know" replaced "I'll handle it." People adapted, assuming this was a phase. No one suspected intent. They simply felt a subtle increase in friction, an inconvenience they couldn't quite locate. His family felt it differently. I was still kind, still present, but less available. Conversations stayed pleasant and shallow. I didn't volunteer reassurance. I didn't absorb tension. When disagreements surfaced, I didn't step in to smooth them over. The space I vacated wasn't empty, it was exposed. Small conflicts lingered longer. Decisions took more time. The efficiency they had grown used to began to erode. No one blamed me. They couldn't. I hadn't changed enough to be accused of anything. I had simply stopped compensating. My husband felt it most acutely. He began asking questions, not about the truth, but about me. "You've been distant," he said one evening, not accusing, curious. "Is everything okay?" I looked at him and considered how many times I had asked that same question in the past. How often I had been reassured instead of informed. "Yes," I said, "everything is exactly what it is." He didn't press, he rarely did, but the atmosphere shifted, not dramatically, quietly, the way a room feels when someone important hasn't arrived yet. He started explaining himself more, unprompted, filling silences I wasn't trying to create. The more I withdrew my emotional labor, the more visible his omissions became. And then, without my involvement, something else happened. The truth began leaking. Not from me, from the system built to contain it. A scheduling conflict exposed a lie. A misplaced assumption revealed an inconsistency. Someone asked a question that couldn't be answered cleanly. I watched as he recalibrated in real time, adjusting stories, revising timelines. The effort was subtle but constant. Secrets require maintenance, and maintenance requires energy. I was no longer supplying any. By the time he realized something fundamental had changed, the change was already irreversible. He wasn't losing me yet, not in any way he could name, but he was losing the version of life that made his balancing act possible. The quiet order had begun to unravel, and all I had done was stop holding it together. By the time panic appeared, it was already too late. It didn't arrive as fear at first. It arrived as urgency, disguised as concern. Questions are asked more frequently, check-ins that lingered a second too long. A sudden interest in my thoughts, my schedule, my mood. He began paying attention in ways he hadn't before, not deeply, but anxiously. "Are you happy?" he asked one morning, standing in the doorway as I gathered my things. The question would have meant something once. Now it sounded like someone checking the foundation after noticing a crack. "I'm aware," I said. He frowned, unsure how to interpret that. Awareness is unsettling when you're hoping for reassurance. He tried to reinsert himself into routines I had quietly reclaimed. Suggested plans, proposed trips, spoke about the future with renewed enthusiasm, as if momentum alone could realign what had shifted. I listened. I didn't correct him. What he didn't understand was that this wasn't about effort. It was about timing. You cannot repair a structure when the person who held it together has already stepped away internally. You can only delay the collapse, and even that requires cooperation. He began volunteering information, unprompted details, over-explanations, casual disclosures meant to signal transparency without naming what had never been disclosed. Each attempt revealed how carefully he had calibrated what I was allowed to know. One evening, he mentioned the child indirectly, still without naming it as such. "She depends on me," he said, as if testing the weight of the sentence. "I've always taken responsibility." I met his eyes. Responsibility requires consent from the people it affects. The room went very still. That was the first time he realized something fundamental had shifted. Not because I raised my voice, but because I had finally named a truth without cushioning it. From that moment on, his behavior changed. He grew restless, distracted, alternately attentive and distant, as if trying to solve a problem without admitting what it was. He asked what I wanted, but only in general terms. He avoided specifics. Specifics are dangerous when you already know the answer. I could see him calculating, wondering how much I knew when I knew it, what I intended to do. That uncertainty unsettled him more than any accusation could have. There is a particular kind of regret that appears when people realize the window for honesty has closed. Not remorse for the act itself, but for the loss of control over its narrative. He wanted to fix things. I believe that. But fixing requires acknowledgement. And acknowledgement would have required him to admit that I had been excluded from a decision that shaped our entire marriage. That admission never came. Instead, there were apologies without context, promises without specificity, a renewed effort to be present that arrived after presence no longer meant safety. I watched all of this with a strange calm, not because I lacked feeling, but because I had already done my grieving in private. The future I thought I was building had dissolved quietly without spectacle. What remained was clarity. One night, as we sat across from each other in the living room, he said, "I feel like I'm losing you." I nodded. "You are." There was no cruelty in my tone, no satisfaction, just a fact. He looked stunned, not because of the words, but because of how long it had taken him to hear them. By then, there was nothing left to fix. You cannot undo the choice to withhold something foundational. You can only live with the consequences of having done so. And those consequences were already in motion. The confrontation, when it finally happened, did not resemble what people imagine when they hear that word. There was no raised voice, no tears used as leverage, no list of grievances was laid out for impact. It was quiet, almost procedural. I chose the moment carefully, not because I needed control, but because I needed accuracy. We were alone. There were no distractions. Nothing urgent is pulling attention away. "I know about your child," I said. That was it. No preamble, no explanation of how I knew, no accusation woven into the sentence. He went very still. In that pause, I saw the full cost of his silence. The exhaustion of maintaining a truth he believed he could manage indefinitely. The realization that his careful timing had run out. He didn't deny it. That told me everything I needed to know. "I was going to tell you," he said finally. I nodded. "At some point is not the same as before." He tried then truly to explain, to contextualize, to soften the impact with reasons, timelines, and intentions that had existed entirely without me. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I said, "Do you understand that you removed my ability to consent to this life?" That was the question he could not answer. Consent is not about forgiveness. It's about agency. And he had assumed mine instead of honoring it. "I didn't want to lose you," he said. "I was never yours to manage," I replied. There was no anger in my voice, only clarity. Anger would have suggested this was still negotiable. It wasn't. I told him what I had decided, not as an ultimatum, not as a punishment, but as a conclusion. "I won't continue a marriage that began without full truth," I said. "This isn't about blame. It's about alignment." He asked if there was anything he could do. I considered that question carefully before answering. "No," I said, "because anything done now would be about repair, not integrity." We sat with that for a long moment. I didn't demand explanations about the past. I didn't ask for assurances about the future. There was no benefit in extracting details that wouldn't change the outcome. What mattered was that the story, as it stood, could not support a shared life without requiring me to diminish myself. I explained the next steps calmly, practically. There were no threats, no dramatics, just boundaries. He listened. He didn't interrupt. For the first time, he seemed to understand the weight of what he had chosen not to share. When the conversation ended, there was no sense of victory, only a quiet finality. I stood up, gathered my things, and left the room, not as an exit stage for impact, but as the natural conclusion of a decision already made. The confrontation did not change him. It clarified me, and that was enough. After everything was said, life did not collapse. That surprised people. There was no dramatic unraveling, no visible devastation. The world continued at its usual pace, indifferent to personal endings. I returned to work. I met friends for coffee. I slept through the night more often than I had in months. What changed was not the structure of my days, but the quality of my presence within them. I was no longer managing other people's comfort at the expense of my own clarity. In the months that followed, people asked careful questions. Some were curious, some were kind. Some wanted a story with villains and heroes. I didn't give them one. I said only what was true and necessary. There was a foundational omission, I told them. I chose not to build on that. That sentence held. It didn't invite debate. What I learned during that time was how much of my identity had been shaped by restraint, by being the one who made things easier for others. Without that role, there was space. At first unfamiliar, then welcome. I began noticing my own preferences again. How I liked my mornings, what conversations energized me, which silences felt peaceful instead of tense. I stopped equating calm with endurance. Calm, I realized, can also come from alignment. There were moments of grief, yes, but they were honest, not frantic. Grief for what I had believed in, not for what I had lost. I allowed it to move through me without turning it into a narrative or performance. I did not need to be admired for leaving. I needed to be at peace with having stayed as long as I did, and with having left when staying would have meant betraying myself. I also recognized something else. My quiet had never been a weakness. It had been discernment. I had spent years observing, absorbing, and understanding systems without disrupting them. That skill had protected me, not by preventing harm, but by ensuring I met it awake. Now I use that discernment differently. I ask questions early. I expect transparency as a baseline, not a reward. I do not confuse patience with permission. The people in my life now know me not as the stabilizer, but as a participant. Someone who speaks when something matters, and is silent only when silence is chosen, not imposed. I am still calm, still reflective, but I'm no longer invisible. What I carry forward is not bitterness, it is precision. I know what alignment feels like now. I know the cost of ignoring intuition in favor of harmony. And I know that dignity does not require noise to be felt. Who I am now is not defined by what happened to me. I am defined by how clearly I saw it, and how deliberately I responded. There is a temptation, when a story ends like this, to search for a lesson sharp enough to warn others away from similar pain. A rule, a checklist, something simple enough to promise safety. I don't believe life works that way. What I believe, what this experience taught me, is quieter. Truth does not always arrive with urgency. Sometimes it waits to see whether you are paying attention. Silence is not inherently virtuous, and it is not inherently weak. It becomes one or the other depending on whether it is chosen consciously or inherited unconsciously. For a long time, my silence belonged to the expectations around me. When it became mine again, everything changed. I don't regret being patient. I don't regret loving carefully. And I don't regret staying calm when others might have demanded spectacle. Those choices were aligned with who I was at the time. What I would not do again is confuse composure with consent. Love that requires you to know less than the truth is not protection, it is management. And being managed is not the same as being cared for. I didn't leave because there was a child. I didn't leave because of a secret alone. I left because the truth was withheld long enough to shape a life without my informed participation. That distinction matters. People often ask whether I forgive him. Forgiveness to me is not a transaction. It is not something owed or requested. It is a private decision about what you carry forward. What I carried forward was clarity. Clarity that honesty delayed is still dishonesty. Clarity that calm endurance can become self-erasure if left unexamined. Clarity that dignity is not loud, but it is unmistakable. If you are listening to this and recognizing yourself in the margins of the story, not in the shock, but in the quiet adjustments, the rationalizations, the moments you told yourself it's probably nothing, I want you to hear this. Your awareness is not an inconvenience. Your questions are not a threat. And your silence should never be used as evidence of agreement. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop explaining other people's behavior and start observing what it requires of you. And then decide deliberately whether that cost aligns with who you are becoming. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need validation. I needed my life to make sense again. And now it does. If you feel comfortable sharing, I'd like to ask you one final question. One that doesn't demand answers, only reflection. Have you ever stayed quiet because you were being understanding, and later realized you were the only one doing the understanding? If so, you're not alone, and your clarity when it comes will not need permission.